Paul Kjellander, who's president of National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners and also chairs the Idaho Public Utilities Commission. He served on the PUC in Idaho since 2011 and is its current chair. You may not know, but in addition, he is a very brilliant and talented artist, and you see his work often on the cover of Public Utility Fortnightly. So it's a pleasure to have you here, Paul, and take it away.
Well, thank you, Sheila. It's always good to see you. I get the pleasure of being a state regulator in the fastest growing state in the nation, and I also live in the fastest growing city within that state. I come from Boise, Idaho. So to say that we get a firsthand look of how things have gotten a little unpredictable and out of whack is clearly an understatement. If you want to get a closer picture of what's happening in our marketplace, all I need to do is look at the house across the street from me. It's 3,000 square feet. 2.5 years ago, that house sold for $350,000. 2.5 months ago, it sold for $750,000. And that's just sort of the magnitude of what we've been seeing in this area as far as growth is concerned, and just trying to get access to available housing. Another example of the magnitude of the growth that we've been seeing in this way is this little town of Kuna, Idaho. When I moved here 3 decades ago, that town had about 3,000 people. And the front page story in the news then was that they had a salamander problem in their water and sewer system. Now, if you fast forward 3 decades, that community has over 30,000 people in 3 high schools, and the pace of growth is just not slowing down at all. So you have to recognize what's that mean to a utility, whether you're an electric utility or natural gas distribution company, as it relates to infrastructure needs. And you can only imagine that it's difficult. As an example, a utility that I have the pleasure of regulating, a company called Idaho Power, they were looking at their deficit year, next deficit year being somewhere around 2027 to 2028. And because of all the growth that we've seen across the state, that deficit year has now moved up to 2023. So from a utilities perspective, as well as regulators, you just have to recognize that things are so dynamic and so significant that you have several things you have to try to keep up with, not just dealing with the infrastructure needs as you deal with the growth, but then trying to plan for the future as far as infrastructure needs are concerned, based on some of the things you've heard from the other speakers today. I mean, it's just coming at us left and right. And so you've got existing infrastructure needs as well as trying to deal with what's coming down the pike in the future. So it's becoming a much more difficult task for everybody that's involved in the process. As I look at some of the things that I'd at least like to touch on today, there are 2 main issues within the infrastructure realm that I want to deal with, because trying to unpack it all is impossible. The laundry list of infrastructure concerns are almost too long to even try to incorporate within a 15-minute presentation. So what I want to focus on today are transmission and hardening of systems specifically related to storm events. I'm going to touch on wildfire because I'm from the West. But as I look at this, first and foremost, I want to start with transmission. The first thing that I think needs to be recognized is, as we look at that infrastructure, is that clearly one size does not fit all. And I know that there are a lot of people who sit back and they think of transmission as one sort of unique system, and that what you may do on a national level is something that you can sort of lay out across the country, and it's just not the case. And what I'll do is I'll try to illustrate that with what I've seen in the West, and I'll take the Gateway West project that was proposed back in 2007. And the problem that we face in the West isn't states and local units of government and private property as far as siting. It's access to federal land. When we look at a lot of states in the West, and Idaho again is a prime example, we are peppered with federal land, whether it's Forest Service, BLM, across the board. And each national forest or national park has a separate management system, different environmental interest concerns. And when you go through that NEPA EIS process for siting, it's extremely lengthy. When I take the Gateway West project, it was one that was going to start in eastern Wyoming, wind its way through Utah, Idaho, Oregon, and all the way up into Washington. It would have been one of the largest machines built if it actually had been constructed. There are pieces that are being constructed. I'll go ahead and jump to the end of that. But as far as siting was concerned, again, the project started in 2007. It was put on the fast track by the Obama administration, and the federal siting wasn't completed until about 2018. Now, as you can imagine, as you start to look at infrastructure needs, that project was being proposed to try to bring a lot of trapped wind from Wyoming into the system that could then get into the grid and throughout the West. But by the time that it finally gets sited, the need for that generation resource, utilities had to find other options to serve the load as it evolved and grew, similar to what I talked about, the pace of growth that we've seen in our state. You can't wait. You have to serve that load, so you got to find other options. And that almost makes that transmission line obsolete before you can even break ground. Another example of how federal land is the issue in the West, at least for us, another company that I get to regulate, Rocky Mountain Power. They proposed a line in around 2007, 2008 called Ben Lomond to Populous. I love the names of these. And it was going to run from basically the Salt Lake Valley all the way up into eastern Idaho. That thing got built in record pace. Within 3 years, the line was constructed and energized. And why? They found a line and a path that didn't touch a single parcel of federal land. The thing got built. And that's the thing that I think really needs to help illustrate how access, again, to federal land is an extremely difficult scenario. And that's the concern we have in our neck of the woods. Why I'm also excited about transmission, though, too, and I do want to give a shout out to FERC. We have all recognized that transmission is key and that there are tremendous regional differences in the transmission system, especially as we start to look at infrastructure needs, whether it's cost allocation in terms of building those new lines. In the East, there's a lot of interest in trying to bring some offshore wind into the marketplace. And so, of course, you're going to have to have new transmission for that. So we've been working with FERC, and they approved recently the creation of a new federal state joint task force on transmission. And they're going to be kicking off their first live meeting at our NARUC annual meeting, which I hope will be in person in November in Louisville. And the importance of that, again, and I want to stress this, is the opportunity for state and federal regulators to have some legitimate open dialogue about the needs for more infrastructure, and to have some real conversations before NOPRs show up, and before we're in the middle, in the throes of cases in front of FERC and running into ex parte considerations, that we can actually have that dialogue so that we can talk about those regional considerations and concerns, so that perhaps maybe when we do get to the NOPR stage, it's more informed, and we as state regulators can be more engaged in that process in helping to develop that record. Because again, we all recognize that the infrastructure needs are extremely important, and probably the most important thing we're going to be dealing with over the next few years. So let me shift gears from transmission as infrastructure considerations and talk a little bit just about hardening of systems and how to deal with infrastructure as it relates to natural disasters. I had the good fortune yesterday of being able to talk to a reporter from the Washington Post about that specific issue, and also had I heard a shout out to a commissioner from New Jersey. A commissioner from New Jersey was on that call with me, and I was very grateful that we had Diane Solomon, who's also the chair of NARUC's Critical Infrastructure Committee, because she's lived through, as a regulator, Sandy, and she's also lived through the recent flooding that they've seen over the last few weeks, and she was able to offer some tremendous perspectives. But the general gist of the question that the reporter was trying to get at is, why can't you as regulators and utilities create and harden the system and the infrastructure that needs to happen in order to avoid many of these blackouts and the length of blackouts that we have today? And the short answer was, it's about money. We could do almost everything to try to create a system that is super hardened, that will be extraordinarily resilient, that we could get power back up very, very quickly after a major event. But the problem is the amount of money it would take to make that happen would make the cost of electricity, no one could afford it. And that's the trouble spot with all this, is that, yes, there's a lot that can be done, and yes, there's a lot that regulators need to do. We have a prime example. If you do nothing, for example, Texas, or not enough, you're gone as a regulator, and life is more difficult. and lives are lost. But on the flip side of that is you have to try to balance it with the need to make sure that the energy resource is affordable. So that's a key piece of it. If we take one specific issue, and that's burying high capacity transmission lines, as I looked at it several years back, I think the range of cost for above ground transmission was between 1.5 and 2.5 million dollars per mile. If you look to underground that, I've heard estimates from multiple folks, but it's you look at multiplying that by 4 to 5 times per mile. So it's extremely expensive to try and underground all of that transmission, just as a case in point. And also when you look to harden, I mean, there were some people in regulators and others in flood zones. And so as a case in point, a hypothetical, if your last flood was 14 feet and you've got your substations, at ground level, and you said, okay, we're going to raise those to 16 feet. And then the next flood comes in and it happens to be 20 feet of water. I mean, again, how do you predict what's happening as we look at what's occurring in climate and the more severe weather events that we've been seeing? Those things are difficult. So I'll shift really quickly to wildfire, which is something I have a little more experience with. And again, I'll go back to the phrase that, one size just doesn't fit all, even in the West, as we look at wildfire. We have learned a lot from our neighbors to the West, and especially from California, because they've been seeing some very severe wildfire over the last few years. And in fact, their wildfire season, the wildfire season in the West used to run from about mid-June to about early October. In October, the temperatures would cool. You'd start to see snow in the higher elevations of the mountains, and the fires would eventually burn themselves out. But now, if you talk to regulators and others that follow the wildfire events in California, it seems like the wildfire season never ceases. It starts earlier, it burns hotter, faster, and stronger. These fires, when they get going, start to whip up their own weather. There are tornado events like that these wildfires will create. So imagine trying to deal with that in Santa Ana winds, some of the other events that they have that will just push these fires through a forest in a matter of minutes. We are fortunate in my state not to have the Santa Ana or Diablo winds. So again, one size doesn't fit all. The things that they need to do for hardening in California, while some of them are very beneficial throughout the West, aren't necessarily the same measures that we will deploy as far as trying to harden our system and infrastructure needs as we look at some of those events. I think where we really are in wildfire throughout the West too, there are 3 words I think that are the most significant as we look at how we manage infrastructure to deal with that, and that's data, data, and data. Every one of the utilities has hired groups that not only will help them gather the weather data, issues about moisture and content level on forest ground, the health of the trees in the forests, so that they can then analyze that and begin to target their financial resources, which I think is becoming more and more important. In the past, as we looked at the infrastructure as it relates to wildfire prevention, what we were really looking at more was sort of putting it on a rotation where every 3 years you would move through with your vegetation management program, and as you sort of rotated it through. Well, now with the more severe weather events and need to protect that infrastructure, they're micro-targeting through the data that they've been analyzing where they need to make that investment and additional investment in infrastructure hardening. So that's becoming a much more of an issue for us as regulators to deal with. Okay, this year we're looking at it, so now we need to bury these distribution lines to help because this is an area that's higher risk, or we need to put more attention to the vegetation management there, or we need to remove all those wood poles and try to put up metal poles or other fire retardant measures that we can put on some of those transmission poles. So the landscape is dramatically changing as we look at infrastructure needs. And again, it's not a one size fits all, even with wildfires across the West. I think what I'll do at that point is simply sort of try to bring my thoughts into a landing by just basically suggesting that, really on the topic of energy infrastructure, there really is never enough time to touch on all the issues that matter and all the issues that are going to result in increased costs for energy throughout the nation. And it seems that we're always just scratching the surface on these conversations. So I'm very grateful that you brought this this matter forward in this meeting. But I think the most important thing, again, to recognize is that as regulators and energy providers, we should always be taking steps and identifying those next steps to help us deal with our infrastructure needs. And I'll leave you with one final thought in this area is that anyone who proclaims themselves to be an expert, they're probably not. And anyone who says, trust me, probably isn't trustworthy. So thanks again for everything, and I look forward to the continuation of this conversation.
Philo, you're on mute.
Well, I'm glad I'm not having me as a technological speaker. Anyway, so Paul, as we go forward and you move on from the regulatory role, what do you want to be your legacy that you have left with not just NARUC, not a single commission, or in the domestic sense, but internationally? What do you want to share with the world as far as the things that you've learned, the things that you've seen, the things that could be better?
You know, I'm reminded of the old politician as he was retiring, who was asked a similar question, and he said, "You know, when I got into this job, I wanted to change the world, and now I just want to leave the room with a little dignity." I think that's probably at the core of it. You know, what I hope more than anything is that we can create the appropriate educational opportunities for regulators to tackle these issues. A lot of people aren't aware of the harsh reality of being a regulator, in that the average tenure of a state commissioner is 4 years. 4 years. And many state regulators come into those positions. Some get elected, and they don't get elected because of everything they know about the utility sector. They get elected because they're more popular than the person they ran against. And then others like me, you know, my main qualification was that I knew the governor. I was appointed. I'd like to think I knew a little bit more about the utility sector, but the case in point is, if I'm completely honest, as a new regulator coming in, thinking I knew something about utilities and regulation, the reality is it took about 3 years for me to get my feet underneath me so that I could feel confident in some of the decisions that I was making. And if the average tenure is only 4 years, you got to look at the need to educate regulators and to create the platform for them to get up to speed sooner so they can be sharper and stronger in their roles that's significantly important. So I think that's not the legacy that I necessarily would think. Talking about your own legacy makes you feel like the next step is to write your own obit. Instead, I think that's really the role of our National Association. We begin to laser focus on that over this last year. And so that's what I really hope we can do, is create that opportunity. Because again, just on the subject of infrastructure, that is going to drive so many of the cases that show up in state commission venues over the next, for the remainder of the time moving forward. All the new technologies coming down the pike. When's the right time to pull the trigger on trying to bring in utility scale battery storage as infrastructure? What's going to happen in the arena of hydrogen? Is that going to be legit? Is that going to be ready for prime time? And so what kind of storage are we going to have to develop for that? Additionally, you would have to build an entirely new pipeline system if you're going to move to 100% hydrogen. That's no simple process. So, you know, if I were to look at what I hope we can do, that's to, you know, take advantage of what we've been learning over the last year and a half as we've been forced to use more technology to communicate, and figure out ways in which we can get some on-demand educational resources that are honest broker resources that can help utility regulators get up to speed much quicker, and then help them continue to tackle some of the extraordinarily difficult issues that are going to be coming down the pike.